detailed explanation, which is a presentation of classifications of designations. There are 3 subparts within this second part: a general presentation, a specific explanation, and integration following these 2 presentations. We're currently focusing on the second part, the specific explanation, which is an enumeration of the most important designation. Within this part, Mipham Rinpoche explains within 12 points certain aspects of Buddhist theory of knowledge. We covered the first 6 of these 12 points and are now looking at the 7th point, which concerns the classification of objects and knowledge. We first looked at the different types of knowledge. Yesterday we covered inexact knowledge, misunderstanding, mistaken understanding, and doubt. And then we came to exact knowledge. Concerning exact knowledge, the root text says, perfect understanding has 2 causes: direct, exact cognition and deductive, exact knowledge. You can find this in the root text. Exact knowledge can be summarized within perfect comprehension, perfect understanding, which has 2 causes. Either direct exact cognition, that concerns the 4 types of direct knowledge, exact knowledge, or deductive exact knowledge. We're looking at the first cause, which is the types of direct exact knowledge. These 4 types of direct exact knowledge are sensory direct knowledge, direct mental knowledge, self-knowing knowledge, and direct yogic knowledge. Out of these 4, yesterday we covered sensory knowledge, direct sensory knowledge, and then came to direct mental knowledge. What Khenpo explained concerning direct mental knowledge is that direct mental knowledge is a non-conceptual cognition and unmistaken cognition. It is born based on the governing condition, which is mental faculty, governing mental faculty. Sensory cognition arises based on sense faculty. For example, direct visual knowledge arises based on eye faculty. Direct mental knowledge arises based on mental faculty or governing mental faculty. This is simply the fact that a previous moment of knowledge ceases, which allows for the subsequent moment of knowledge to appear. We won't get into the details of mental faculty now. Nevertheless, we can say that it is one of the 6 consciousnesses, sensory or mental knowledge, a moment of knowledge that ceases and allows for the appearance of a subsequent moment of knowledge. Like sensory knowledge, direct mental knowledge is non-conceptual and unmistaken. When we say that it's non-conceptual, what does that mean? It means that this type of knowledge is free of conceptualization. What is conceptualization? This is fusing sound and object, or mixing sound and object, or name and object. When we say that these types of knowledge are non-conceptual, it means that they are free from conceptualization, which mixes into one the sound and the object, or fuses together sound and object, sound or name. These two are always linked. We hear a word, and conceptualization mixes the sound or the word and the object. And we are no longer in direct contact with the object. And in terms of conceptualization, we have fused the sound with the object. We think that it is the same thing. When I hear the word table, when someone says that's a table, my conceptual knowledge mixes the word or the sound table with this object that is here in front of me, and will think that this word table is the same thing as the object table. Conceptual knowledge is not in direct knowledge with the object as it is. There's a mix that occurs with the name or the sound of the word. So we say that these types of knowledge are non-conceptual and also that they are unmistaken. What does this mean? It means that these types of knowledge know their object directly. What does it mean to know the object directly? It means that they do not know things like conceptual knowledge, which thinks that the generic object that appears to cognition is the specific object or the concrete object. I'll say this again. Conceptual knowledge, this is another way of considering what we talked about earlier. There is a concrete object, the specific object or object of specific nature, and then there is a generic object or the abstraction of an object. Conceptual knowledge thinks that the generic object or the abstraction of the object is the same thing as the concrete object. When I see this table, my conceptual knowledge will think that the generalization or the generic table is the same thing as this concrete object. This is a mistaken way of knowing. Direct knowledge does not function in this way. It doesn't mix, it doesn't think that a generic object is a specific or concrete object. It knows the specific object directly. Another thing that is said is that direct mental knowledge is simultaneous with sense knowledge. There's a moment of direct sensory knowledge, and at the same time, direct sensory knowledge that perceives this table, and at the same time, there is direct mental knowledge that is also operating. There are some divergences concerning the way that this functions. Some scholars of the past, belonging to the Vaibhashika school, which is one of the schools of thought of the foundational vehicle, sorry. The Vaibhashika say that the object of direct mental knowledge is the same as that of direct sensory knowledge. The object of direct mental knowledge and the object of direct sensory knowledge is the same. They think that direct mental knowledge and direct sensory knowledge perceive the same object. Then there is another school of thought of the foundational vehicle, the Sautrantika school. They don't agree with this. They say that the object of direct mental knowledge is an aspect that appears within direct sensory knowledge. What they say is that it's not logical that two types of knowledge or moments of knowledge see the same object. For the Sautrantika, this is not logical. For them, each perception should have its own object. Otherwise, there is some kind of confusion. As it was said concerning non-conceptual knowledge, the object as it is seen in a clear and direct way. But if two moments of knowledge are produced at the same time and see the same thing, then it is no longer true, it is no longer clear and direct. So what they say is that these two types of knowledge, direct sensory knowledge and direct mental knowledge, see different things. Direct sensory knowledge sees the object as it is, and direct mental knowledge doesn't see the object in and of itself. It sees an aspect of the object that appears within direct sensory knowledge. So that covers direct mental knowledge. The third type of direct knowledge is self-knowing knowledge. What is self-knowing knowledge? It is non-conceptual, unmistaken cognition that experiences characteristics specific to mind and mental events. What are the characteristics specific to mind and mental events? These are the fact that they are animate and knowing, or clear and knowing. The characteristics of mind and the mental events is that they are clear and knowing. This term, animate, is a term that Khenpo explained earlier, meaning that there is a succession, an uninterrupted continuity of moments, and knowing refers to the capacity to know. There can be other explanations. In any case, those are the explanations that were given here. So fundamentally, mind is animate or clear and knowing. And this is what self-knowing knowledge knows. This self-knowing knowledge, we can say that it is the aspect of knowledge that is looking inward. This self-knowing knowledge is not directed towards an outer object. It has no outer object. It just knows the mind's own characteristic, the fact that it is clear and knowing. This aspect, self-knowing knowledge, we find this with all types of knowledge, whether it's conceptual or non-conceptual. This aspect of self-knowing knowledge is present for every type of knowledge. The fourth type of direct knowledge is direct yogic knowledge, or direct knowledge of a yogi. Direct yogic knowledge is non-conceptual, unmistaken knowledge that relies on the governing condition, which is the practice of mental calm and higher vision or penetrating vision, what are called Shine and Laktong in Tibetan. So this practice of mental calm and higher vision are the governing condition that allow for this type of knowledge to arise. So this covers the four types of direct knowledge, which are the cause for perfect understanding. The first type of cause for perfect understanding. Khenpo developed the link between self-knowing knowledge and yogic knowledge a little bit afterwards, based on a question that someone asked. The question is self-knowing knowledge linked with Buddha nature? Khenpo replied that in treatises such as the Gyulama, Buddha nature or the essence of the Tathagatas is defined as being emptiness in essence and luminosity in its nature, or luminous clarity. For us as beginners, this Buddha nature, whose nature is emptiness and whose essence is emptiness and whose nature is clarity, luminous clarity, it can only be known intellectually, but conceptual knowledge, but we don't have, because we don't have access to yogic knowledge. He explained that sometimes when we see this, when there's suffering, when the suffering is present in the mind, it's based on knowledge that we experience this suffering. suffering is not experienced elsewhere than in the mind. And we experience this suffering thinking that it is real. The sensation of suffering is based on grasping the reality of suffering, and mind experiences this sensation. Concerning Buddha nature, the empty essence and nature that is luminosity are also known by way of the mind that experiences this. This is like as with suffering. Mind is what knows this empty essence and luminous nature of mind. More precisely, it is by way of self-knowing knowledge that this empty essence and this nature that is luminosity are experienced by beginners. So in the beginning, for beginning practitioners, we experience this empty essence and the nature that is luminosity by way of self-knowing knowledge. And when there is experience of this, then conceptual activity does not occur. When we can abide in an even state with this nature, then the conceptual process is not present. This Buddha nature cannot be defined by signs, nor by designations, or by generic objects. Self-knowing knowledge is what experiences empty essence and nature that is luminosity. In the beginning, this only lasts for a moment. Then we have to familiarize ourselves with this experience. We need to cultivate it. And after some time, when there is sufficient familiarization, when this familiarization is complete, then the fourth type of direct knowledge, which is yogic direct knowledge, can occur. This concerns the four types of direct, exact knowledge. As we saw in the root text, that I will cite once more, perfect understanding, what we're talking about here, has two causes. The first, that we have just covered, direct, exact cognition, and the second, which is deductive exact knowledge. And the root text says, both of these have the effect that is decisive knowledge, determined knowledge. So now we have covered direct exact knowledge. Now we will look at deductive exact knowledge. This deductive exact knowledge is conceptual. It relies on an authentic argument. Based on this authentic reasoning, there is an exact conclusion that occurs. Therefore, it makes no errors concerning the object that is present. Khenpo illustrates this with various examples. This knowledge is conceptual. It relies on an authentic argument. Based on this authentic reason, there is an exact conclusion produced, and therefore it does not make mistakes concerning the present object, the object that is present. And then there are examples to illustrate this. If we consider a mug, it is impermanent. The argument that allows for proving this is the fact that this mug is fabricated, it is conditioned. That's the argument that proves that the mug is impermanent. If I'm going too fast, just let me know. Another example is that where we deduce the presence of fire based on smoke. We see smoke behind a hill, for example, and we then draw the conclusion that there is a fire behind the hill. When we come to this conclusion that there is a fire, we have not seen the fire, we've only seen the smoke. The smoke that is rising from the hill is the reason that we have deduced that there is a fire. Smoke is an authentic argument. Indeed, if we go behind the hill, we'll find the fire. Thus, there is no error, even though this knowledge is conceptual knowledge. Another example that is given is the example of the existence of successive lifetimes. Presently, none of us can directly see how this occurs. It is beyond our capacity for the moment. How can we acquire exact deductive knowledge of this subject and thus know if what the Buddha said concerning successive lifetimes is true? We can do it. We can determine the existence of these successive lifetimes based on authentic arguments. For example, it is explained that all sentient beings, whether they're mammals or other types of beings, immediately look for food following their birth. For example, a newborn baby will try to find their mother's breast. Other types of beings will try to look for other types of food. No one needs to teach a baby this. They do it instinctively, without a need for anyone to show them how. And this is because beings have done this so many times in previous lifetimes that it occurs automatically following birth. This is the argument that shows that this was cultivated in previous lifetimes. Another authentic argument is that of observing mind in the present. If we think about what we have studied concerning mind's way of functioning, we may be capable of seeing that right now there is an animate and knowing moment. What has produced this animate and knowing moment? It can only have been produced by something identical. In other words, an animate and knowing moment, the previous one. It can't occur or come from something else. This present moment appears based on a continuity of knowledge or moments of knowledge. This is why we can correctly conclude that there has been a previous moment of knowledge, that itself was preceded by another, etc. We can continue backwards in this way all the way through presence within the bardo. So then what entered the mother's womb in this lifetime? It is a moment, or it was a clear or animate and knowing moment. And this also applies to mind stream within the bardo. We can come back, can go back further and further in the same way through previous lifetimes, on and on. Thus, it is certain that this present clear and knowing moment will produce a subsequent clear and knowing moment, and so on and so on. So concerning the future, there we also find this progression of animate and knowing moments. This conclusion is exact, even though it is conceptual knowledge. There's no other possibility concerning mind and its functioning besides this succession of clear and knowing moments. Thus, we can understand the principle of rebirth. We can understand that the principle of rebirth is exact. It's not just something that we believe, but based on authentic arguments, we can know that it is really what happens. Then, concerning place of birth, body at birth, there are differences because the place for each birth is not always the same. The body at birth is not always the same. We aren't born with the same body from one life to another. What's born is mind. When people ask themselves what their past rebirths were, in fact, we don't really need to know. It's sufficient to look at the present circumstances of body and mind, and we'll have an idea of their past lives. Because the circumstances, the current circumstances, are the result of what occurred in the past lives, previous lives. So we can get an idea of our previous rebirths by examining our current circumstances. For example, in the world, no one wants to suffer. There are no beings who wish to suffer. All beings wish to be happy and find themselves in good circumstances. And yet, though everyone wishes for the same thing, not everyone manages this. Some people make a great deal of effort and they still don't find happiness. Others find happiness easily. It comes naturally. These differences are related to acts committed in previous lifetimes. These differences depend on positive and negative actions of the past. Furthermore, we don't need to think much about future rebirths. It is enough to consider what we're actually doing, and we'll have a pretty good idea of the place where we will be reborn. This type of deduction is a process by which we can draw exact conclusions. It is knowledge that relies on an authentic argument, and thus it is what we call deductive exact knowledge. So here we've just stated the different types of authentic knowledge. As a reminder, we are looking at the 7th classification of designations, the different types of objects and knowledge. We covered the different types of knowledge, which concerned exact and inexact knowledge, and now we'll look at the different types of objects of knowledge. Before we consider objects of knowledge, we'll take a short silent break. Concerning objects of knowledge, the text says, concerning objects, an apparent object is an object of non-conceptual knowledge, such as visible form, etc. A considered object is an object that conceptual knowledge considers by way of the generic object. These two, likewise, when they are object of engagement and of abstaining for a person, are called object of engagement, and when they are grasped by cognition, they are called the grasped object. Objects are classified into 4 types: apparent object, considered object, object of engagement, and grasped object. We'll look at apparent objects first. The root text says, concerning objects, an apparent object is an object of non-conceptual knowledge, such as visible form, etc. The apparent object is explained first. What characterizes it? The apparent object is an object that is apparent in the sense that it is clearly there. We can also say that it is manifest or evident. It is clearly seen or heard, felt, tasted, etc. The object is apparent to all types of direct knowledge. In other words, all types of non-conceptual knowledge. This apparent object is a specific object, an object of specific nature. As we saw, the objects of non-conceptual knowledge are specific objects. The apparent object is manifest or evident to direct knowledge. It is a specific object. Then we have the considered object. The root text says, a considered object is an object that conceptual knowledge considers by way of generic object. Here the sentence mentions conceptual knowledge. We may ask ourselves if conceptual knowledge has an apparent object or not. The answer is no. Conceptual knowledge does not have an apparent object. Why? Because the true object of conceptual knowledge is a generic object. Conceptual knowledge, as we saw, does not have access to the specific object, and therefore does not have access to an apparent object, which is a specific object, a concrete object, what is clearly there, clearly seen, clearly heard. An apparent object is an object of non-conceptual knowledge, and not an object of conceptual knowledge. The true object of conceptual knowledge is the generic object. This generic object, generalization, abstraction, is a non-efficient phenomenon. It doesn't have any efficiency. It's not functioning. It doesn't function. If we pour water in the idea of a vase, it won't work. The water will just pour onto the ground. Only a specific vase, the concrete object, can hold water that we pour into it. In this case, the vase will truly accomplish its function. And thus we call it an efficient phenomenon, functioning phenomenon. For example, if we think about the city of Périgueux, what appears to our cognition won't be very clear. It's not the city of Périgueux will appear, but in a coarse way to the mind. There won't be any subtle clarity. The city will appear in a coarse way in the mind. When we think about the city of Périgueux, conceptual knowledge is acting, and thus we are in the presence of a generic object. We're not in contact with the functioning phenomenon, Périgueux. We're not in contact with the specific object, concrete object. This generic object is non-functioning. But when conceptual knowledge engages with the true Périgueux, this... Wait, what? Can't be conceptual knowledge. When knowledge... What? Okay, that is what he's saying. Conceptual knowledge will engage toward the true phenomenon of Périgueux. Then, Périgueux that appears in the mind and the specific phenomenon of Périgueux, the concrete phenomenon of Périgueux, get mixed in the mind. Conceptual knowledge creates a designation connected to this mix of the two. When it is said in the text that a considered object is an object that conceptual knowledge considers by way of the generic object, the considered object is the specific phenomenon, Périgueux in this case, or the object of engagement. But what appears to conceptual knowledge is not the specific object because it doesn't have access. What appears is the generic object, Périgueux. And what conceptual knowledge does is it mixes these two. It mixes the specific phenomenon, the specific object, and the generic object. And as he often does, Khenpo Rinpoche related this to the practice on the Buddhist path, which is useful for us in practice. So what did he said, so what does this mean in the context of practicing the Buddhist path? He says, most of you meditate on Chenrezi, and the image that you're meditating on is that of a white bodhisattva with 4 arms, carrying a certain number or wearing a certain number of decorations, ornaments. Visualizing this image, this semblance of form, is not meditating on Chenrezi. That's not what cultivating Chenrezi means. In this case, we're simply cultivating an image, a semblance of a form. Doing this is part of training in meditation, but it's not meditation itself. Cultivating this image of Chenrezi will allow for mind to become stable, to not jump from one thing to another, to not produce all kinds of thoughts in relation to this or that. And so it will allow us to reduce mind's agitation, to train in mental calm. And once we are able to remain in a calm state, once we have pacified thoughts, and once there is less agitation, then we will be able to contemplate the symbolic meaning of the image. In this example, we'll contemplate the symbolic meaning of Chenrezi. The white color of Chenrezi is a symbol of the fact that his mind is pure, that it is not contaminated by dualistic view, meaning that we don't find the flaw of grasping the flaw of the idea of one who grasps and the object that is grasped. This dualistic point of view is not present. Then his 4 arms symbolize the fact that Chenrezi has fully accomplished the 4 immeasurables: compassion, joy, equanimity, and love. So the point isn't just visualizing somebody with 4 arms for no particular reason. If that were the case, an individual with 4 arms would be something quite strange. Many people might even think that they're handicapped. Concerning Chenrezi's 4 arms, 2 are held together at the level of the heart, holding a jewel. The jewel symbolizes the fact that Chenrezi is able to confer the 2 accomplishments: worldly accomplishments and accomplishments that go beyond the world. Then a 3rd arm or hand is holding a rosary, a mala. This mala symbolizes the actions by which Chenrezi guides beings who are imprisoned within the 3 realms of samsara toward liberation. The 4th hand holds a lotus flower. This lotus flower symbolizes the fact that Chunrezi remains completely pure and is not contaminated by the circumstances of the samsaric conditions when he chooses to be reborn in order to aid beings. Chunrezi is able to take birth in any condition, animal, human, etc. And regardless of the type or the circumstances of birth, he is not contaminated by these circumstances. And then lastly, Chunrezi is wearing various types of ornaments that symbolize his complete accomplishment of the 6 paramitas. The name Chunrezi refers to the bodhisattva who has accomplished all of this. It doesn't just refer to someone with 4 arms. When it is said within the Vajrayana that we become enlightened to the Yidam's nature, this is what is meant. Becoming enlightened to the Yidam's nature, in the case of Chunrezi, occurs based on practicing Chunrezi and attaining the state of Chunrezi, enlightenment that is the state of Chunrezi. If we consider this in the context of what has just been explained related to mind's functioning, conceptual and non-conceptual states, first, my conceptual knowledge cultivates a generic object. And this is the step where we say we visualize. Conceptual knowledge visualizes. Then it remembers the meaning. It's also necessary for mind to cultivate the meaning of all this. The meaning of the 4 immeasurables, the 6 paramitas, etc. We cultivate the meaning of the 4 immeasurables and the 6 paramitas again and again. And once this familiarization has been fully accomplished, and likewise, when familiarization with compassion is fully accomplished, then it is possible to engage with or toward the specific object. In the beginning, we were connected with the generic object, but then, thanks to familiarization with the paramitas, the 4 immeasurables, these different qualities, once we are familiar, once we have familiarized ourselves with compassion as well, then we will be able to engage in the direction of the specific object, Chunrezi himself. And then, when we engage in the direction of the specific object, in terms of the specific object, then we become this specific object. We incarnate Chunrezi. In the context of Tibetan Buddhism, it is then said that we are an emanation of Chunrezi. When it is said that a Buddhist master is an incarnation of Chenrezig. This is what this refers to. All of this occurs based on mind's functioning. So that covers the first two objects, the apparent object and the considered object. Now we come to the object of engagement. Here it says, these two likewise, when they are object of engagement and abstaining for a person, are called object of engagement, and when they are grasped by cognition, they are called grasped object. Khenpo Rinpoche did not explain the object of engagement explicitly, but he did talk about it a little when he was talking about the considered object. What he said, as you may recall, is that conceptual knowledge that has, for example, an unclear idea of périgueux, a generic of périgueux, when this conceptual knowledge engages in the direction of the true city of Périgueux, then the object of engagement is Périgueux, the specific object. The object of engagement is the specific object toward which conceptual knowledge is engaging. And then the translator asked, when we go to Périgueux, what happens? We're in the presence of the apparent object. So is the object of engagement obtained? And Khenpo said yes. If we go there, then the object of engagement is obtained. We're in contact with the specific object. The object of engagement is the specific object toward which conceptual knowledge engages. Conceptual knowledge mixes this specific object with the generic object and thinks that they are the same thing. Then, when we find ourselves facing the object itself, concrete object, for example, if we go to the city of Périgueux, then we obtain the object of engagement. Khenpo Rinpoche talked about conceptual knowledge, saying that it engages in the direction of the outer phenomenon, Périgueux in this case. This doesn't mean that there's not an object of engagement for non-conceptual knowledge, but he was only talking about conceptual knowledge. In Tibetan, apparent object is non-nul, considered object is shen-nul, and object of engagement is chuk-yul. Khenpo didn't explain the grasped object, so I can't give you a definition. I think it's Zunyu, but he didn't give further explanation, so I can't say more. So that concerns the object of engagement. Concerning grasped objects, we didn't get any explanations on this subject, so I cannot say anything. Then the root text states, such are the classifications of objects and what possesses the object. This concludes the 7th point, which lays out types of exact and inexact knowledge as well as their objects. That concludes the 7th classification of designations, which then brings us to the 8th classification of designations. Here we are talking about opposition and link. We'll begin with opposition. The root text says, in the classifications of opposition and link, there are, to begin, 2 oppositions. Opposition of non-coexistence is the fact that continuities do not cohabit with a same capacity. It is twofold. Opposition of cognition, such as self-grasping and grasping the non-existence of self, and opposition of object, such as hot tactile phenomenon and cold tactile phenomenon. Second, the opposition mutual exclusion, which is twofold, direct opposition, such as permanent and impermanent, and indirect opposition between an included phenomenon of one of its opposites and the other opposites, such as permanent and conditioned. Opposition involves the idea of opposite things. If 2 things are opposite, it means that they are completely different. If they had something in common, then we wouldn't call them opposites. We can distinguish 2 types of opposites. The opposition of non-coexistence and opposition of mutual exclusion. So we'll begin with opposition of non-coexistence. We'll reread the root text concerning opposition of non-coexistence. It is the fact that continuities do not cohabit with a same capacity. So to begin with, there are things that are so different that they cannot coexist. In other words, they cannot mix together. Of course, these 2 opposites can exist in the same moment, in the same room, but they can't mix together. If they come into contact, one will cancel out the other. The root text says these continuities do not cohabit with a same capacity. One's capacity will be cancelled out by the others. And the root text explains that this is twofold. This opposition of non-coexistence is twofold. Opposition of cognition and opposition of object. Concerning opposition of cognition, the root text says, opposition of cognition, like self-grasping and grasping the non-existence of self. This first type of opposition is opposition that occurs based on cognition. This concerns knowledge that cannot exist in the same moment in the mind. One will cancel out the other. For example, as the example is given in the root text, the idea of self and the realization of the absence of self. Within the mind, these two conceptualizations, self-grasping and the absence of self, can never be present at the same time. Consider a moment of mind. The person who has realized the absence of self has cancelled out the notion of a self. We cannot find these two at the same time. There is no longer any thought of self in the mind of such an individual. The opposite is also true. So long as the idea of a self is present in the mind of an individual, they will not realize or not see the absence of self. These two are opposite in that they are so opposite that they cancel one another out. That covers the opposition of cognition. The second type of opposition of non-coexistence is the opposition of object. The root text says, the opposition of object, like hot tactile phenomenon and cold tactile phenomenon. So this concerns the second type of opposition. We can consider the example of a fire. While the fire is burning, there is no cold tangibility, tactile phenomenon. The opposite of heat is cold. The opposite of cold is heat. A high temperature and a low temperature cannot occur at the same time. They are opposites that cancel each other out. Water and fire are also opposites that cancel each other out. They cannot be mixed. That was the first type of opposition, opposition of non-coexistence. Then comes the second type of opposition, opposition of mutual exclusion. Oh, Khenpo Chödrak Rinpoche did not give explanations on this. Nevertheless, I will read the root text slowly so that you can each reflect on what this might mean. Opposition of mutual exclusion is twofold. Direct opposition, such as permanent and impermanent. That's the first type of opposition of mutual exclusion. Direct opposition. The second type of opposition of mutual exclusion is indirect opposition. Indirect opposition between the encompassed of one of the opposites and the other opposite, like permanent and conditioned. Indirect opposition between the encompassed of one of the opposites and the other opposite, like permanent and conditioned. We'll leave things here for today. That leaves a few minutes for questions. Can you hear me? Life and death. Life and death. Oui, and? Is this an opposition of non-coexistence or opposition of mutual exclusion? Well, it's pretty simple. Since we didn't get any explanations on opposition of mutual exclusion, it means that I cannot answer this question. I can simply answer that I can answer with my own understanding, or not, I don't know. If we look at opposition of non-coexistence, which was explained, where one cancels the other out, we can't live and die in the same moment. They don't mix. But I can't give you a true answer. Maybe Olivier has something else to say? No. Thank you both for this presentation. My question concerns the part that Olivier repeated. When you talked about self-knowing knowledge, you shared this sentence saying that within each knowledge, the aspect of self-knowing knowledge is present. I'd just like to confirm my understanding. Does this mean that this, even including imperfect knowledge, we saw 3 types of imperfect knowledge and perfect understanding? Does this mean that every type of understanding, including the 3 types of imperfect understanding, the possibility for perfect understanding is present in the form of self-knowing knowledge? Yes, that's what Khenpo said. This aspect of self-knowing knowledge is present with all types of knowledge, whether they are mistaken or not. What he said is the essence of all conceptual or non-conceptual knowledge, mistaken or not, is self-knowing knowledge. What I understand is that it's not necessarily because it's present that we have access to it. Concerning mistaken knowledge, this aspect of self-knowing knowledge is parallel to it, but when we are in these types of mistaken knowledge, we don't have access to self-knowing knowledge. We're just in mistaken knowledge. That's why it is inexact knowledge. Do you have an example of direct mental knowledge? As it was stated, I don't get it. And I have another question concerning the different objects. There's a question of objects of engagement and abstaining. You explain the object of engagement. Is there an explanation for objects of abstaining? There were no explanations for objects of abstaining. For the first question, Khenpo didn't give any examples other than what I shared concerning that according to the Vaibhashika, direct mental knowledge knows the concrete object, the specific knowledge, just as sensory knowledge does. Or, according to the Sautrantika, direct mental knowledge knows an aspect of this specific object, which is present on the level of sensory knowledge. And once again, concerning object of engagement, you gave the example of the city of Périgueux. Before I engage with it, I have a generic object. Do you have to go by way of the generic object? Or can I just can I directly contact a specific object, one that's unknown, without going through generic object? For conceptual knowledge, it always functions by way of generic object. It never has contact with a specific object. What I understand and what's said here is that if I want to engage in the direction of an object and obtain it, then it becomes an object of engagement. And this object of engagement is a specific phenomenon. However, what appears to my conceptual knowledge is the generic object. I'll engage in the direction of Périgueux. The object of engagement is Périgueux, the specific object. I want to go there. But what appears to my conceptual knowledge is the generic object. And then I will mix the two and think that they're one and the same thing. But the generic object is always what appears to conceptual knowledge. Okay, but let's say I'm planning to go to Périgueux, but before I go, I have a generic object. But it could happen that I encounter an object without having planned to engage with it. It's a surprise. And in this case, there won't have been a generic object beforehand. Do we still have to go through the generic object unless it appears at the moment that I see the surprise? When we say we'll enter into contact with the specific object, non-conceptual knowledge is what enters into contact with specific object. When I reach Périgueux, my sensory knowledge, my direct mental knowledge, is what is in contact with the specific object. But it's not because you're in Périgueux that your conceptual knowledge can enter into contact with the specific object. Nevertheless, your conceptual knowledge is in contact with a generic object. And when I encounter something by accident here, a table, for example, my sensory knowledge are in contact with the specific object. They know the specific object, but immediately my conceptual knowledge will conceptualize all of that, and it's not explained here, but Khenpo explained it elsewhere. Immediately, conceptual knowledge is present. In terms of what I'm conscious of, it's only the generic object in terms of conceptual object. In fact, I only have access to conceptual knowledge as an ordinary individual. Yes, non-conceptual knowledge is functioning, but I don't have awareness of them. I only interact in terms of my conceptual knowledge. I only know by way of my conceptual knowledge. Does that answer the question? Yes. It's time. Questions tomorrow. Is it a small question? Oh, okay, go ahead. Again, related to direct mental knowledge, you explained the point of view of the Vaibhashika and the Sautrantika. For the Vaibhashika, direct mental knowledge sees the specific object directly. For the Sautrantika, it sees an aspect on the level of sensory knowledge. For the Vaibhashika, I understand that this occurs at the same time. For the Sautrantika, if direct mental knowledge sees what is in sensory knowledge, I can't understand how it can occur simultaneously. I wanted to know if there was a difference in terms of timing for one or the other. Khenpo didn't give any further explanations about this. He said it was at the same time, but I can't say more. There are other models as well, but in this case it was explained by that. Like to that. See you tomorrow.
Et à 17h30, l'Assemblée générale.